My name is Keith Gessen. I've been asked to talk about the Anna Politkovskaya trial, which I wrote about from the New Yorker. Anna Politkovskaya was killed on a Saturday as she was coming home with some groceries. It was a weekend. She was not on her regular schedule, but her shooter entered the building just minutes before she came in and waited for her, indicating that she was being followed. He shot her 4 times after she entered the elevator, dropped his gun, and quietly left the building. She was discovered by a neighbor who called the elevator up to the 8th floor. A year ago, 2 years after she was killed, the people charged in her killing were brought to trial in Moscow. Investigators appeared to have a strong case. Politkovskaya was living at the time on a fairly busy street in the center of Moscow. The building was surrounded by cameras. In addition to the camera outside the door-to-door entryway, which showed the killer, a thin man in a baseball cap, entering the building, and then it showed Politkovskaya coming up to the building, going in, and then a few minutes later it showed the killer coming out. There were at least 6 other cameras in the vicinity. Several of the cameras had captured what was almost definitely the killer's car. The crime lab was able to figure out the car's license plate. The car was found in a Moscow garage. The owner of the car, a Chechen man named Rustam Mahmudov, had fled, but 2 of his brothers, who were in Moscow at the time, had been taken into custody. Police had cell phone records, or they claimed to have cell phone records, which showed that the brothers were near the scene of the crime on the day that it happened, and under questioning they could give no explanation for why they'd been there. And that was not all they had. They had a police officer, a detective, whom another police officer accused of asking him to work on Politkovskaya a month before she was shot. They had an FSB officer, which is the successor agency to the KGB, who had told investigators that a Chechen businessman had asked him to look up Politkovskaya's address in their database, in the FSB database, also a month before the shooting. Investigators said that they had evidence of contacts between all of these people at separate times. So these were not just a bunch of people they'd picked up in a bar somewhere. A day before the defense began to present its case, Stanislav Markelov, who we heard about just a few minutes ago, was shot in the head in broad daylight in the center of Moscow, about a mile from the courtroom. So there was a moral climate, there was a news climate, and there was a political climate for finding these people guilty. And I came in convinced, when I went to the trial, that I was going to look into the face of the people who had participated in the killing of Anna Politkovskaya. That's not what happened. The case fell apart very quickly. The first defense testimony was from the younger of the Makhmudov brothers, who turned out not to be a lowlife, but a guy who was applying to graduate school. He had written his senior thesis on the Chechen refugee problem. He knew who Politkovskaya was, and he was a total sweetheart. The prosecution's case against the 2 brothers, who were supposedly in the vicinity of the crime, relied very heavily on cell phone records. But it turned out there were a great many problems with the records, which the lead defense attorney, a young Chechen named Murad Musayev, began to uncover as the trial went along. The calls did not line up. So you had outgoing calls from one brother, but no incoming call analogous on the other brother's phone. Calls seem to have been added on different days to make the records on the day in question more convincing. At one point, the defense lawyer turned to the police detective who was on trial as the organizer of the murder and said, "Did you used to forge police records? Did you used to forge phone records like the ones we're looking at in this court?" And he said, "Yes, I did used to forge phone records, and I did a much better job than these guys did." The accusation about the police detective turned out to be from another detective who owed him a great sum of money and was consequently highly interested in putting him in jail. The FSB officer recanted his earlier statement that he had been asked to look up records. In a bizarre turn of his testimony, he said, "I'm a servant of the state. The state asked me to help out in the investigation, and I told them what they said they wanted to hear." Finally, and most devastating, I think, for the prosecution, the defense was able to introduce into evidence a video of the alleged shooter, Rustam Mahmudov, and it just wasn't the same person as the one on the surveillance camera. They were able to introduce this video even though Rustam, the alleged shooter, was not on trial because it was in the cell phone of one of the brothers who was on trial. And I was in the courtroom during a break when they had just discovered this accidentally on Jabrail Mahmudov's cell phone, and they were playing it for the first time in the courtroom during a break. And Ilya Politkovsky, Anna Politkovskaya's son, who was at every day of the trial and was very involved in it, obviously emotionally, and he had to watch this video, and I was standing next to him, of the Mahmudov brothers. They were near a river down in Chechnya, and they were throwing mud at each other and playing. And it was very difficult to watch for two reasons. One was this was after his mother had been shot, and to watch these people frolicking was offensive and difficult. But also it was very clear from that video that Rustam was a big, fat guy, and the guy photographed by the surveillance camera going into and out of the entryway was a thin guy, and it was not the same guy. And the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty, which is the only verdict they could have come back with. A few months ago, as with all cases where a jury does not go along with the prosecutors appeal, the higher court overturns the decision, and in this case, sometimes you have a retrial. In this case, the lower court that had tried initially sent it back to investigators to do a better investigation, but there is no confidence, there is no reason to think that they're going to come up with a better case than the one they came up with the first time. And I've spent a certain amount of time thinking about what this case meant. People were worried about all sorts of things. They were worried about the judge, that the judge was going to be in the tank for the prosecution and was going to aid the prosecution, but in fact the judge did a pretty good job. Novaya Gazeta, the great opposition paper for which Politkovskaya worked, was very worried that the other journalists at the trial were going to become emotionally involved with the defendants and were not going to cover the trial properly, but in fact the press did a very good job of covering the trial. Then, when it became clear that the jury ought to bring back a not guilty verdict, the press was worried that the jury was going to be tampered with, which often happens in jury cases. But in fact, the jury was not tampered with. So the only people who didn't do their job were the police, who are so good at framing up cases against scientists and against human rights workers, and who are so good at running sweeps in Chechnya. But they were not able to get it together to put away people who I don't think they were guilty of the things they were accused of, but they certainly knew things that they were not saying. And so you had a case where part of the system pushed back against another part of the system. I think the prosecutors wanted a guilty verdict, and the people who opposed this did the right thing and brought back a not guilty verdict. So that's an optimistic thing. Russia is not just a place where people are getting killed all the time. It's a place where people go to work, and they go to the movies, and they fall in love. But in a broader way, what happened at this trial was that you saw that everybody did their job, but the truly outstanding people were Anna Politkovskaya, the defense lawyer, and the people who killed Anna Politkovskaya. They were the ones who really did the best job. They were the most competent. And when you have a situation where the most competent, the most highly trained, and the best protected people in your society are trained killers, then you have a real problem that I don't know what you do about. Thank you.